Today's question is one that's interesting to two groups of people, PhDs in physics and fans of the Insane Clown Posse. Magnets, how do they work? But since I'm neither of those two things, let me pose a question that interests me, a neuroscientist. Magnetosensation, how does that work? Put a human near a magnet, like you might do going into an fMRI, and you feel nothing. However, other organisms throughout the animal kingdom are capable of sensing magnetic fields, and these magnetic fields have a strong influence on their behaviors. For example, it is theorized that many migratory birds actually use magnetic fields to figure out if they're flying north or south. And if you glue a little magnet onto their little bird heads, it messes with their direction of migration. The abdomen of honeybees have cells that contain iron. Honeybees can actually be conditioned to open their weird little mouths whenever they're in magnetic fields. And dolphins, which move around on a seasonal basis, prefer to interact with objects that have magnetic properties, hinting that they can sense these magnets too. A 2015 study published in eLife suggests that tiny little critters, like the nematode C. elegans, can also sense magnetic fields. Now, most people don't really care too much about C. elegans. They're just little worms living in the dirt, minding their own business. But C. elegans is a very important animal species for neuroscientists. One thing that modern neuroscientists are absolutely obsessed with is understanding how neurons connect to one another. Now, a kind of map that shows how the neurons are connected is called a connectome. And C. elegans was the first animal to have their entire connectome mapped out. Even though they only have 302 neurons, it was still a very challenging task. Now, C. elegans actually recently gained some notoriety in the Great Worm War of 2020. Dr. Michael Eisen, a professor of genetics at UC Berkeley, casually dropped a comment on a popular social media site about worm behavior. He jokingly commented that all they do is wiggle forwards, wiggle backwards, and sometimes f*** themselves. Which is true, because they're hermaphrodites. That means they're able to make both male and female reproductive cells. Somehow, Dr. Eisen, who studies fruit flies, by the way, was accused of being sexist and racist? It was a very bizarre sequence of events. But it got people talking about C. elegans, and put the little worm on people's radars. Okay, now let's get back to magnets and dig a little deeper into this study. Now, digging a little deeper is exactly what a C. elegans would do. That is, if they were hungry. That's what figure 1 of this publication shows. Now, this is kind of an important study concerning C. elegans. Most studies with C. elegans have them living on a 2-dimensional lawn, and being on a little plate only allows for 2 dimensions of analysis, which doesn't really mimic the way these worms are in the real world. So the experimental setup described here allows us to visualize the direction of the worm movement in all 3 dimensions. Brief diversion back to magnets. We don't feel it, but we're always under the influence of a really large magnetic field. This magnetic field is created by the movement of molten metals deep inside the Earth's core. So the field isn't very strong, but it is extremely large. It extends hundreds of Earths all the way out into space. Weak as it is, this magnetic field still influences worm behavior. They don't care too much about gravity to figure out which way is up. If you took some of these hungry worms and put them in a reverse polarity field, they start moving up. Now in figure 2, they start playing around with magnetic fields in really interesting and creative ways. They artificially created a magnetic field that cancels out the Earth's natural magnetic field in that position, and they found that the worms just move around at random. Then they showed that worm movement was dependent on the strength of the field. If you give them a little field, they move a little bit, and if you give them a really strong field, they move a lot. Now, depending on where you are on the Earth, the magnetic field has a slightly different strength and direction. This observation leads to maybe my favorite control experiment in all of science. The researchers, based in America by the way, were curious about the source of these worms, and they found that these animals were ordered from Bristol, England. Now, to see if worms from around the world behave differently, they ordered from all sorts of different places. They got Seville, Spain, they got Nairobi, Kenya, Edinburgh, Scotland, Chile, Australia, Portugal. It's basically a where in the world is worm in San Diego. Now, when testing these international worms, they found a really neat linear correlation between the magnetic fields of their homelands and the directions they move in the magnet. Next, they did what I think to be the most important study in this whole thing. They identified the neurons that are responsible for magnetosensation. Now, with worms, that's fairly easy, right? They only have 302 neurons, to the point where we can actually give every single neuron a name. In this study, the neurons of interest are called the AFD neurons. Other research groups have done work on these AFD neurons. They're really important for a behavior called thermotaxis, which is moving towards or away from temperatures. The researchers then got their hands on a bunch of worms with various defects in types of neurons. Now, most of these neurons are responsible for some kind of sensory component. You have the oxygen sensors, you have those mechanosensors, light sensors, and so on. And affecting these cells didn't affect the animal's behavior in a magnetic field. But the worms with the defects in the AFD neurons had no idea how to behave in a magnet. This provides the evidence that there's a specific type of neuron that's responsible for the ability to sense magnets. And this is big, because this hasn't been done before. Now, they don't clearly get to a mechanism, but they did narrow down the field quite a bit. They figured out that there's a molecule called cyclic GMP, and this is a molecule that you and I use all the time too. But it seems to play a really big role in magnetosensation in these worms. So, magnetosensation, how does it work? I think the more interesting question is, when did we lose this sense? When in the evolutionary timeline did we stop caring about magnetic fields? And when did it stop influencing human behavior? I'm sure there are all kinds of evolutionary biologists out there who have some kind of answer. Why don't you go ahead and drop it in the comments for me below? Don't have an idea? Give me a wild guess, and also let me know below. Thanks for joining me today. Have a wonderful day and stay curious.